Hidden Agendas. Chapter 1. The Newcomer. Emily Warren stood at the edge of the crowded room, her eyes scanning the sea of well-dressed politicians and power players. She was the newest member of Congress, a fresh face with an unyielding resolve to make a difference. The evening's event was supposed to be a celebration, a testament to her hard-earned victory in a fiercely contested election. But beneath the surface of the polished smiles and polite conversations, Emily felt an undercurrent of tension. The whispers had started almost immediately after her swearing in. Small comments from seasoned colleagues, sideways glances, and a lingering sense of unease that she couldn't quite shake. As she navigated through the evening, exchanging pleasantries and shaking hands, she felt the weight of the unspoken words that seemed to hang in the air. It was during a quiet moment on the balcony, away from the buzz of the party, that she first heard the voices. Low, urgent tones carried on the cool night breeze, drifting from a corner shrouded in darkness. Emily stepped closer, straining to make out the words. "Not supposed to be here. She's a wild card. We need to neutralize the threat before it spirals out of control." Emily's heart skipped a beat. The voices were unfamiliar, but the intent was clear. Someone was plotting, and they were talking about her. She leaned in further, trying to see who was speaking, but all she could make out were the shadows of two men, their faces obscured. The conversation continued, but the words became more indistinct as they moved further away, retreating into the depths of the night. Emily stayed frozen for a moment, her mind racing. What had she just stumbled upon? Who were those men, and what threat did they perceive her to be? As she returned to the party, she forced a smile, but the gnawing feeling in her gut wouldn't subside. She had worked too hard, sacrificed too much, to let her career be derailed by shadowy figures whispering in the dark. Whatever they were planning, Emily knew she had to uncover it before they made their move. But she would need allies, and she would need them fast. Because in the world of politics, trust was a currency more valuable than gold, and Emily Warren was about to find out just how costly betrayal could be. Chapter 2. The First Threat. The next morning, Emily sat at her desk in her Capitol Hill office, the events of the previous night still swirling in her mind. The voices, the threat, they were real, but there was nothing concrete she could take to anyone without sounding paranoid. Her first instinct was to go to her chief of staff, Henry Lawson, a veteran political strategist who had been with her since the early days of her campaign. Henry was in his early 50s, with a gruff demeanor that masked a sharp intellect and a loyalty Emily had come to depend on. She trusted him implicitly, but this was a different kind of challenge. If there was a conspiracy against her, she needed to be careful about who she confided in, even with someone like Henry. She decided to start with a vague mention of her concerns, hoping to gauge his reaction. As she outlined her sense of unease, Henry listened carefully, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Emily, this is Washington," he said finally, leaning back in his chair. "Paranoia is part of the job description. But if you're feeling like there's something more to this, we need to be smart about how we approach it. Any idea who those men might have been?" "No," Emily admitted, frustration evident in her voice. "I couldn't see them, and I only caught a few words. But they seemed to be talking about me as a threat." Henry nodded thoughtfully. "All right. Let's not jump to conclusions just yet. We'll keep our ears to the ground, see if anything comes up that might point us in the right direction. In the meantime, I'll start making discreet inquiries." Emily felt a little more at ease with Henry on her side, but the anxiety still gnawed at her. She knew Washington was full of political maneuvering, but the idea that someone might be targeting her so soon after taking office was unsettling. The rest of the day passed in a blur of meetings and legislative briefings, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. It wasn't until late in the afternoon, as she was wrapping up her last meeting, that she received the first tangible sign that her fears weren't unfounded. A plain envelope had been left on her desk. No address, no markings, just her name scrawled across the front in an unfamiliar hand. She opened it cautiously, her breath catching as she unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. "Stop digging or you won't like what you find." The message was typed, impersonal, and terrifying in its simplicity. Emily's hands trembled slightly as she read it again, her mind racing. Someone knew she was onto them, and they were already trying to scare her off. But instead of deterring her, the threat only steeled her resolve. Whatever was going on, it was bigger than she had imagined. And now, she had proof that someone was willing to go to great lengths to keep her in the dark. She slipped the note into her purse, her mind already racing with plans. She needed to find out who was behind this and why they were so desperate to silence her. The game had just begun, and Emily Warren wasn't about to back down. Chapter 3. A friendly warning. The tension in the room was palpable as Emily sat across from Senator Richard Hayes, one of the most influential figures on Capitol Hill. Richard was a man who exuded power and confidence, his silver hair and sharp blue eyes giving him a commanding presence that few dared to challenge. He had invited Emily to lunch, a gesture that, under normal circumstances, would have been seen as an honor for a junior congresswoman. But after the events of the last few days, Emily couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. As they exchanged pleasantries over the first course, Richard seemed genuinely interested in Emily's policy initiatives and her vision for the future. But as the conversation progressed, she noticed a subtle shift in his demeanor. His questions became more pointed, probing at her motivations and her loyalties. "So, Emily," Richard said, leaning back in his chair as the waiter cleared their plates, "I hear you've been making quite an impression in your first few weeks. People are starting to take notice." Emily forced a smile, trying to match his casual tone. "I'm just trying to do my job, Senator. Serve my constituents and make a difference where I can." Richard nodded, a faint smile playing on his lips. "That's admirable. But you should know Washington is a city built on alliances. And sometimes, knowing when to step back is just as important as knowing when to push forward." There it was, the warning she had been expecting. Emily's pulse quickened, but she kept her expression neutral. "I appreciate the advice, Senator, but I'm not sure I understand what you're getting at." Richard's smile widened slightly, though his eyes remained cold. "I'm just saying that there are certain issues, certain agendas that might not be worth pursuing. At least, not if you want to maintain your career and your safety." Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she realized the full weight of his words. This wasn't just a friendly warning, it was a thinly veiled threat. But she couldn't afford to show any fear. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, meeting his gaze with quiet defiance. "Thank you, Senator. I'll keep that in mind." Richard held her stare for a moment as if assessing her resolve, before finally nodding. "Good. I'd hate to see a promising young politician like you get caught up in something unpleasant." The rest of the lunch passed in a blur of polite conversation, but Emily's mind was racing. Richard Hayes was clearly involved in whatever conspiracy she had stumbled upon, and now he had made it clear that she was being watched, and that any further investigation could come at a high cost. As she left the restaurant, Emily knew she had to be even more careful. Richard's warning only confirmed what she had already suspected. This was bigger than just a few shadowy figures in the dark. This was a full-blown conspiracy with powerful players who wouldn't hesitate to take her down if she got too close. But Emily wasn't about to back down. Not now, not when she was so close to uncovering the truth. The note, the threats, they only fueled her determination. Whatever was going on, she was going to expose it, no matter the risk. She just had to be smarter, faster, and more discreet than the people trying to stop her. Chapter 4. The Silent Ally. The days that followed were a whirlwind of covert meetings, hushed phone calls, and careful planning. Emily knew she couldn't do this alone, but finding someone she could trust was proving to be more difficult than she had anticipated. Washington was a city where loyalties shifted like the wind, and she couldn't afford to make a misstep. Then, out of the blue, she received a message. It was an encrypted email sent from an anonymous account. The subject line simply read, "We need to talk." The email itself contained little more than a time and place, an address in a less than reputable part of town, the kind of place where deals were made in the shadows, far from the eyes of the law. Despite the risks, Emily knew she had to follow this lead. If someone was reaching out to her, it meant they had information, possibly the key to unraveling the conspiracy. But she couldn't walk into a potential trap without backup. After some consideration, she reached out to Henry, carefully explaining the situation without revealing too much over the phone. Henry was hesitant but agreed to meet her at the designated location, promising to keep a close watch while she made contact with this mysterious informant. As Emily drove through the darkened streets, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating as she navigated the unfamiliar roads. The address led her to a nondescript warehouse, its windows dark and its exterior showing signs of neglect. Emily parked a short distance away and made her way to the entrance, her heart pounding in her chest. She glanced around, catching sight of Henry's car parked nearby, his silhouette barely visible in the dim light. Taking a deep breath, Emily pushed open the heavy door and stepped inside. The interior was just as run down as the exterior, with crates and machinery scattered about. The only light came from a single bulb hanging overhead, casting long shadows that danced across the floor. "Emily Warren," a voice called out from the darkness. It was calm, steady, but carried an edge of urgency. Emily squinted, trying to make out the figure that emerged from the shadows. As they stepped into the light, she recognized the man immediately, Daniel Ross, a former journalist turned whistleblower who had a reputation for exposing corruption at the highest levels. He had been off the grid for months, his name surfacing only in whispers among those who followed the darker side of Washington politics. "Daniel," Emily breathed, a mix of relief and surprise washing over her. "What are you doing here? Why did you reach out to me?" Daniel glanced around, his expression tense. "I've been following the threads, Emily. I know about the threats, the people targeting you. I've been digging into something bigger than either of us imagined, and it all leads back to you." Emily felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you mean? What have you found?" Daniel hesitated, as if weighing his words carefully. "There's a plan in motion, something that's been in the works for years. It involves some of the most powerful people in this city, people who will do anything to keep their secrets buried. They see you as a threat because you're new, because you're not part of their system, and because you've already started pulling at the threads." Emily's mind raced as she processed his words. "What is this plan? And why me?" Daniel took a step closer, lowering his voice. "It's about control, Emily. Control over legislation, over the flow of information, over the very fabric of our democracy. They're afraid you'll uncover the truth, that you'll expose the web of corruption that holds this city together. And they're willing to do whatever it takes to stop you." The enormity of the situation began to sink in. Emily had always known that politics was a dirty game, but this was something else entirely. This was a battle for the soul of the nation, and she had just become a key player in a game she barely understood. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Why not go public with what you know?" Daniel's expression hardened. "Because it's not that simple. They have people everywhere, in every branch of government, in the media. There's no safe place to tell this story. But you're in a position to do something about it. If you can gather enough evidence, if you can expose them, you might just have a chance to bring them down." Emily nodded, a newfound resolve settling in her chest. "What do I need to do?" Daniel handed her a small, encrypted flash drive. "This contains everything I've found so far. Names, dates, connections. It's not enough to take them down, but it's a start. Use it wisely. And be careful, Emily. They're watching your every move." As Daniel disappeared back into the shadows, Emily stood alone in the dimly lit warehouse, the weight of the flash drive in her hand heavier than she could have imagined. The path ahead was fraught with danger, but she knew she couldn't turn back now. The stakes were too high and the truth too important to ignore. Emily Warren was about to go to war against the most powerful forces in Washington, and she had no intention of losing. Chapter 5. The Unseen Enemy. The flash drive Daniel had given her was a ticking time bomb, filled with information that could shake the foundations of Washington. Emily knew that once she plugged it into her computer, there would be no turning back. The names, the connections, it was all too dangerous to ignore, but it also meant she was putting herself in the crosshairs of some of the most powerful and ruthless people in the country. Back in her office, she locked the door and pulled down the blinds, creating a barrier between herself and the outside world. Henry had been watching her closely since their meeting with Daniel, and although he hadn't pressed her for details, she could tell he was worried. Emily appreciated his concern, but this was something she needed to handle alone, at least for now. She inserted the flash drive into her laptop, her fingers trembling slightly as she waited for the files to load. The screen filled with folders, each labeled with cryptic names that hinted at the dark secrets they contained. Emily opened the first one, her eyes scanning the documents with growing horror. There were bank statements showing massive transfers of money to offshore accounts, communications between high-ranking officials discussing policy changes in exchange for favors, and even a list of journalists who had been silenced or bought off to prevent them from reporting on the truth. But the most damning piece of evidence was a dossier on a project called Operation Blackout. It detailed a plan to manipulate key pieces of legislation by controlling the flow of information to Congress, ensuring that only those bills that served the interests of a select few would make it to the floor for a vote. The plan was already in motion, with several high-profile bills set to pass in the coming weeks, all of them designed to benefit a shadowy group of elites at the expense of the American people. Emily's blood ran cold as she realized the full scope of what she was up against. This wasn't just about political maneuvering. This was an outright assault on democracy itself, and she was the one standing in the way. She quickly made copies of the most important files, encrypting them and storing them in multiple secure locations. She knew that simply having the evidence wasn't enough. She needed to get it into the right hands, people who could actually do something about it. But who could she trust? The list of potential allies was growing shorter by the minute. Just as she was finishing her preparations, her phone buzzed with a new message. It was from an unknown number, but the content made her heart skip a beat. "We know what you have. If you want to stay alive, you'll destroy it now." The threat was clear, but it only strengthened her resolve. Emily knew they were watching her, but she couldn't let fear dictate her actions. This was bigger than her career, her ambitions, even her life. If she didn't act, countless others would suffer the consequences of this conspiracy. She took a deep breath, her mind racing as she considered her next move. She couldn't take this to the FBI or any other official agency. They were too deeply entrenched in the very system she was trying to expose. Instead, she needed to go public to get the truth out in a way that couldn't be ignored or covered up. But that would take time she might not have. Emily knew she needed to act quickly before they could silence her for good. With renewed determination, she grabbed her phone and dialed the one person she knew she could trust to help her navigate this treacherous path. "Henry, it's me," she said, her voice steady. "I need your help. We're going to take these bastards down." Chapter 6. The Last Stand. The plan was set in motion the very next day. Emily and Henry worked tirelessly, contacting a select few journalists and whistleblowers who had proven themselves trustworthy over the years. These were people with nothing to lose, individuals who had been marginalized or threatened by the very forces Emily was now fighting against. They were more than willing to help her, recognizing that this might be their last chance to expose the corruption that had tainted the nation's capital. But as the pieces began to fall into place, Emily felt the pressure mounting. The messages from her unseen enemies grew more frequent, each one more threatening than the last. She knew they were getting desperate, and that made them even more dangerous. The final phase of the plan involved a press conference where Emily would go public with the evidence. It would be broadcast live, ensuring that the truth couldn't be suppressed before it reached the public. The conference was scheduled for the following morning, giving her just enough time to finalize the arrangements and prepare for what would likely be the most important and dangerous day of her life. That night, as she sat alone in her office, Emily's thoughts drifted to the events that had led her here. She had come to Washington with the goal of making a difference, of serving the people who had elected her. But she had never imagined that she would find herself at the center of a conspiracy so vast, so insidious, that it threatened the very fabric of the nation. As she reviewed the evidence one last time, Emily heard a noise outside her office door. Her heart skipped a beat as she realized it wasn't Henry. The footsteps were heavy, deliberate. Someone was approaching, and they weren't here to talk. Emily quickly shut down her laptop and reached for the small drawer in her desk where she kept a firearm, a precaution she had never thought she would need. The door creaked open, and a figure stepped into the room, silhouetted by the dim light from the hallway. "Emily Warren," the man said, his voice low and menacing. "You should have listened to the warnings." Emily raised the gun, her hand steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "Who are you? What do you want?" The man stepped closer, revealing a face Emily didn't recognize, cold, emotionless, a professional killer. I'm here to make sure you don't cause any more problems. You've dug too deep and now it's time to end this. Emily's mind raced. She knew she had only seconds to act. If she hesitated, she was dead. But she couldn't let them win, not after everything she had uncovered. With a sudden burst of determination, Emily fired. The gunshot echoed through the office, and the man staggered backward, a look of surprise on his face as he fell to the ground. Emily didn't wait to see if he was dead. She grabbed the laptop and bolted from the office, her heart pounding as she raced down the hallway. She had to get to Henry to finalize the arrangements for the press conference. There was no turning back now. As she reached the exit, Emily heard more footsteps, reinforcements no doubt sent to finish the job. She pushed open the door and ran into the night, her mind focused on one thing: getting the truth out before they could stop her. The next morning, the press conference went ahead as planned. Emily stood before the cameras, the weight of the evidence heavy in her hands. The room was packed with reporters, and the tension was palpable as she stepped up to the podium. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice clear and strong, "what I'm about to reveal to you is a story of corruption and conspiracy at the highest levels of our government. But it's more than that, it's a fight for the soul of our nation. And it's a fight we cannot afford to lose." As she began to lay out the evidence, she could see the shock and outrage spreading through the room. The truth was finally out and there was no going back. Emily knew that her life would never be the same after today. But as she looked out at the sea of faces, she felt a sense of peace. She had done what she came here to do. She had stood up for what was right no matter the cost. And in the end, that was all that mattered.